I never thought much about my family's history. My father used to say we came from a long line of noblemen, but in modern Seoul, that just meant we had an old house and a few relics from the past. One of those relics was a large, dust-covered painting hanging in the study. No one ever talked about it. Didn't pay much attention to it either, until the night everything changed. I had just moved back home after living in the US for a few years. My mother was getting older, and my father had passed away last year. The house felt emptier than I remembered, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly floral. My mother insisted it was just the way hanok houses smelled, but sometimes when I walked through certain rooms, it felt like someone had just been there. That night, I was in the study, looking through some old books, when I noticed the painting again. It was of a woman, her face pale, her eyes sharp, her lips slightly upturned like she knew a secret. She wore a hanbok, the silk looking almost real in the dim light. It should have been just another artifact of the past, but something about it made my skin prickle. The way her eyes seemed too focused, too aware. "Amma," I called out. "Who's the woman in this painting?" My mother shuffled in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. When she saw what I was pointing at, she stopped. Her face tightened. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just an old family piece. You should sleep soon." She turned to leave, but I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. That was the first sign. I should have left it alone. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something move in the hallway. A soft shuffle like silk brushing against wood. At first, I thought it was my mother, but when I checked, the hallway was empty. The floor creaked slightly under my feet. The house was old, it made sounds. That's what I told myself. The next few days, small things kept happening. My phone would vibrate with unknown calls, but when I picked up, there was only static. My mother seemed more tired than usual, her skin looking almost gray under the kitchen lights. Once, I caught her staring at the painting, her lips pressed tightly together, her fingers clutching her rosary beads. "Amma, seriously, what's with this painting?" She sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It should have been burned long ago." That night, I woke up gasping for air. Something heavy pressed down on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes darted around the room, and in the corner, just past the glow of my nightlight, I saw her, the woman from the painting. Her hanbok sleeves draped onto the floor, her hair spilling over her shoulders. She was watching me, her lips curled slightly, but her eyes were empty. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The weight lifted, and I bolted upright, gasping. The next morning, I confronted my mother. "Who is she?" I demanded. "Tell me the truth." She looked away, gripping the edge of the table. "A gumiho," she whispered. "Your ancestor betrayed her. She has never forgiven us." The word sent a chill through me. The gumiho, a nine-tailed fox spirit, was a common folktale, a creature that could take the form of a beautiful woman. Some stories said they ate human livers. Others claimed they sought revenge on those who wronged them. I thought about my father's sudden illness, the relatives who had died young, the strange feeling I always had in this house. It had been centuries since that betrayal, but time meant nothing to spirits. They lingered, they waited. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the study, staring at the painting. My mother had tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I needed to end this, so I did something reckless. I whispered to it, "What do you want?" The room seemed to hum around me. The candle flickered, and then, ever so slightly, the woman in the painting moved. Her head tilted, her lips parted, as if she were about to speak. And then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, but I didn't need light to know I was no longer alone. The air turned cold. The sound of silk brushing against wood filled the room again. And then breath. Right behind me, I turned slowly. The last thing I saw was her eyes, no longer empty, but filled with something deep and knowing. The next morning, my mother found me unconscious on the floor. The painting was gone. The wall where it had hung was empty, but the wood beneath it was stained dark, like something had seeped into it over years. We moved out that same week. My mother never spoke about it again. I tried to forget too, but sometimes, in the dead of night, my phone vibrates with an unknown call, and when I check the screen, I see the reflection of a woman's face staring back at me, one that isn't mine. I didn't think much of the house at first. It was old, sure. The wooden beams were darkened with age, the tiled roof sagged slightly at the edges, and the paper-paneled doors creaked even when no one touched them. But my father liked it. He said hanoks had a way of holding in warmth during winter, keeping families close. My mother had been less enthusiastic, but she never argued against my father's decisions. The first few nights were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels too heavy, like something is waiting to exhale. At night, the wooden floor creaked as if someone were pacing. My mother said it was just the house settling. My younger sister, Mina, wasn't convinced. "Iyama," she whispered one night, clutching her blanket. "Someone is walking outside." My mother sighed and pulled her closer. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The sound came every night. Soft, deliberate steps in the courtyard. The faint swish of fabric, like silk brushing against stone. My father, always the rational one, dismissed it. "Animals," he said, "or maybe a neighbor passing by." But in the middle of the night, when I lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above my bed, I would hear it. Not just footsteps, a slow dragging like someone pulling themselves along the ground. One night, Mina and I sat up, listening. The steps paused right outside the paper window. I held my breath. The thin Hanji screen was translucent in the moonlight, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow. A tall, slouched figure, the hem of a hanbok grazing the ground. Mina whimpered, "Appa, do you see that?" I grabbed her wrist and shook my head, though I did. We didn't speak of it in the morning. Then my father looked out the window. It was late past midnight. My mother had fallen asleep first, and Mina had curled up beside her. I was pretending to be asleep when I heard my father get up. We moved toward the wooden door that opened into the courtyard. The footsteps were already there, slow and steady. My father slid open the paper screen and stepped onto the wooden porch. "Who's there?" His voice was firm. No answer. He hesitated. Then, against all reason, he leaned forward and looked through the wooden lattice of the window. I didn't see what he saw, but I saw his reaction. His body went stiff. He took a slow step back, then another. He shut the door and locked it with trembling hands. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked back to his room, his movements stiff, unnatural. He never spoke again after that night. Doctors said it was a stroke, some kind of trauma-induced shock. He could still move, still eat, still hear us. But his eyes were different, unfocused, hollow. We stayed in the house for a few more years. My mother took care of him, whispering to him as if he could still answer. Mina and I grew used to his silence, though it never stopped feeling wrong. One summer, we found his sketchbook. It was tucked away in a wooden chest, buried beneath old clothes. Mina pulled it out, flipping through the pages. At first, it was nothing, landscapes, quick doodles of birds and trees. Then the drawings changed. The same room, over and over. But in each drawing, there was a figure in the background. Sometimes behind the door, sometimes crouched in a darkened corner. A woman, always in a white hanbok, her hair hanging over her face. Her limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. In the last drawing, she was behind us, standing in the very room where we sat. Mina dropped the sketchbook. My mother picked it up, her face pale. She turned to my father, who was sitting in his usual chair, staring at nothing. Softly, she asked, "Is she still here?" For the first time in years, he moved. A single nod. That night, we left the hanok. We never went back. Even now, I wonder what my father saw that night. I wonder if she followed us when we left. Sometimes, when the house is too quiet, I hear it. The faint swish of fabric, the slow, dragging steps, and I don't look out the window. I never really gave much thought to the old stories people told. In our village, most of the adults liked to explain things away with myths, especially when the unknown or strange happened. There were plenty of rumors, like how the night sky was dotted with ancestors watching over us or how certain animals were bad omens. But the one story that always lingered in the back of my mind was the one about the ginkgo tree. The tree stood on the edge of the village, right where the rice fields met the forest. It had been there as long as anyone could remember. The villagers would always talk about it in hushed voices, usually when they thought the kids weren't paying attention. The older people, especially Elder Park, would give warnings, saying things like, "Don't get too close to the ginkgo tree," or, "If you hear it crying, turn around and run." I was 10 at the time, old enough to know better but young enough to think I knew everything. I'd heard the warnings, of course, but I always dismissed them. My friends and I would gather by the tree sometimes, daring each other to touch the bark or sit under its thick branches. But there was something about the way the tree stood there. So still, so unnervingly quiet, as if it were waiting. One autumn afternoon, it happened. June, my best friend, was always the bolder one of us. He had a way of convincing the others to do things that made you feel like you had no choice. "Let's see if the stories are true," he said. His eyes sparkled with mischief, like he had already made up his mind that he was going to do it. "I'm going to touch the tree." I knew exactly what he meant. The tree wasn't just a tree to us, it was the tree, the one you were warned about your entire life. And yet, a part of me was curious. Maybe it was my pride, or maybe it was the thought that I could be the one to prove it wasn't anything special. We walked toward the tree, past the stone markers that separated the village from the rice fields. The sky was clear, but the air was thick, like something was about to happen. The last of the ginkgo leaves had turned a brilliant gold, falling to the ground in piles that crunched beneath our feet. The silence of the place felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I stopped when we reached the base of the tree. It was larger up close than I had imagined. The roots spread out in all directions, thick and twisted, as if they were trying to crawl into the earth. The bark was rough, ancient-looking, as though it had weathered centuries. But the strangest part was the quietness. The tree stood there, towering over us, not a single leaf fluttering, not a sound. June didn't wait. He placed his hand on the trunk. "See? Nothing," he said, grinning. But his voice wavered, and I could hear it, that subtle shift in his tone. It wasn't as carefree as before. I was about to say something, but then I heard it, a soft cry. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was a sound that I couldn't place. It didn't sound like an animal or the wind, but something much softer, something human. A child's cry. June froze. His face went pale. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. My stomach twisted. I don't know why, but I couldn't move. It was like the sound was pulling me in, coaxing me toward it, making my feet feel heavy. The cry came again, this time louder. It was a sound of sorrow, a helpless, desperate sob. Without thinking, I stepped closer. "What if someone's in trouble?" I said, more to myself than to June. But June wasn't moving. He was already backing away, his eyes darting nervously between me and the tree. Don't go near it," he whispered. "It's the tree. Remember what Elder Park said." I didn't listen. The roots, thick and rough, stretched out before me. I stepped closer to them, my hand reaching toward the base of the tree. The cry rang out again, and this time it seemed to come from all around me. That's when I felt it, cold, wet, a strange pressure around my ankle. I looked down in horror as one of the roots had wrapped itself around my leg, holding me in place. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong, too tight. I kicked, tried to twist my leg free, but the root didn't let go. And then the ground beneath me shifted. I couldn't see it at first, but when I looked down, my heart stopped. Beneath the surface of the earth, I saw them white, hollow shapes, skulls, dozens of them. The roots had been growing over the remains of whoever had been claimed before me. The crying grew louder, closer, almost as if it was coming from inside the earth itself. The tears of the tree, I thought, I don't know why I thought that, but it felt true. There was something old, something ancient beneath that tree, and it had been waiting for someone to come. The roots tightened, pulling me deeper, until I thought I would suffocate. The cry reached a fever pitch, and then, as suddenly as it had started, I was free. I don't remember how it happened. One moment, I was caught. The next, I was lying on the ground by the tree, gasping for breath. My throat was dry. I tried to scream, to call for help, but nothing came out. Just silence. I survived. But something changed in me that day. They say the tree takes something from you when you disobey its warnings. I lost my voice. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said it was psychological, but I knew better. It was the tree, the crying tree. Years passed. Life in the village went on, but I could never escape the memory of that night. The tree was still there, standing tall at the edge of the fields, silent again. And then one evening I heard it, the cry, but this time it was different. It was my voice. At first I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was unmistakable. That same mournful sound, that same desperate sob, was coming from the tree. But it wasn't just any cry. It was my cry. I had never spoken again since that night, but that voice, echoing from the ginkgo tree, sounded exactly like mine. I'm not sure what happened that night, or why the tree chose me, but one thing I know for certain, the tree is still waiting, and now it has my voice.